Our moderator for this next conversation will be Dennis Wilder, who is the managing director for the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues here at Georgetown University, and who have so graciously agreed to host this conversation and convening today. For that, we're grateful, so thank you, Dennis. Dennis is an assistant professor in the Asian Studies program here and is managing director of the Institute. I wish we had an hour or a semester to hear of his previous life experiences. He had an illustrious career at the CIA, where he ended as Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. He also spent several years working for George W. Bush in the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for East Asian Affairs. Dennis, thank you so much for agreeing to host this convening today and for moderating this panel. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. We are your lunchtime entertainment here. Hopefully we will be entertaining. Is anybody here from Notre Dame? Is there? No. Georgetown is the #1 Catholic university in America. We actually have a very long tradition in China. We are a Jesuit university, so we hold to the spirit of Matteo Ricci, who in 1600 served in the court of the emperor in Beijing. He almost got kicked out of the church for the way he brought Christianity to China. If you know, our Jesuit friends have been kicked out of the church once or twice in the past. But we now have a Jesuit pope, and so we're in good stead these days. We at Georgetown have started a new China initiative. I'll just say one or two words about it. We are trying to build our capability for dialogues like this, dialogues between our academic staff and academics in China. We are also building, obviously, substantive relationships with student groups in China. We also have a relationship with the Central Party School in Beijing, the NDRC in Beijing. So we are proudly carrying the flag of dialogue. We are not one of the schools that is worried about Chinese influence. We have 1,000 Chinese students on this campus, and we are proud of them, and we're happy to have them, and we will continue to be happy to have them. So what Walmart asked us to do today was to take this panel in the direction of a 40,000-foot strategic look, as opposed to the panels you've just heard from, which were really on the much more specific sides, which is very good for me because I know almost nothing about food safety, and I certainly know nothing about agriculture. So I'm glad not to be chairing one of those panels. So what we're going to start with today is really the question of where are we on the trade negotiations? What's at stake? And I want to read a quote from the President of the United States, another tweet this morning, in case you haven't heard his tweet of the morning. Anybody not hear this tweet yet? It says, and I quote, "China has agreed to buy massive amounts of additional," and additional is in caps, by the way, "farm and agricultural products. Would be one of the best things to happen to our farmers in many years." So I'm going to throw it over to Ambassador Vettner. Let me just say a couple words about her illustrious background. She was the U.S. Trade Representative on the agricultural side, so Chief Agricultural Negotiator, I guess was the title. She has served many times in U.S. government service, worked on Capitol Hill. I can think of no one better to begin our discussion today, and you are now a month into a new job with Edelman. So please, over to you.
Great. So that's a relatively broad topic we have. What next after that tweet and that comment on the relationship? And I would say that we are at an inflection point with how we want to frame our agricultural relationship with China. And I think we do have to say that that is in part for the willingness of this administration to sort of take them on and to say very directly what some of the concerns are that we have had with trade with China and how it operates. And so, but I think also this focus on what should we get for this inflection point, what might a deal look like that avoids the imposition of a lot of tariffs on both sides of that equation. The fact that agriculture is there is also due to the vocal outcry from the ag community to say, we appreciate this focus on trade policy, we appreciate the focus on China and misbehavior and the need for fairness, but we are an export-dependent agricultural economy, and so we need continued and strengthened trade relationships to make U.S. agriculture work. And so I think part of the reason that ag is the focus of that tweet this morning is precisely because the administration is getting the message that agriculture needs those open markets. And so the administration and the U.S. ag community have highlighted this issue. Now we need to make sure what we get out of it is not a one-off purchase of some ag products and we all go home, but an actual setting of the stage so that we can clear some of the non-tariff barriers, that we can inject transparency more into the system, and create the basis for continued trade after that one set of purchases, and for dialogue that will help us work through future problems. What I don't know is whether we have a plan to do that, and how those relationships, whether the right people will be at the table, what is the plan to deliver, and what, frankly, does success look like? And I think that's a concern not just in agriculture, but on the intellectual property side of the equation, et cetera, that there has not been a clear statement from the administration yet to say, this is what success looks like, or here's how we would work with China to get there. I think saying tomorrow we'd like you to completely revamp your IP regime, our government couldn't deliver that, but there are certainly benchmarks along the way that would highlight progress, and I think that's the same in agriculture as well. So in the short term, I think let's make sure those purchases materialize, but let's make sure they do so in a way that sets the stage for future purchases and not just a one-off exception. And then let's use this opportunity or this focus to create a platform to keep talking in a way that has been more productive than we've had in the past. Frankly, in talking to China about agriculture, and particularly that intersection of agriculture and trade, we've often kind of hit the roadblock where the Ministry of Agriculture will say, my job's not really to worry about the trade rules, it's to increase production in China. I'm happy to cooperate with you on things that will help me do that, but where it comes to trade, go talk to Commerce. And then you go to MOFCOM and they say, we see your point about some concerns about these trade rules, but really, Ministry of Ag's in charge here. And so we haven't been able to get everyone in a room to say, hey, wait a second, we actually have a very deep and very broad relationship in agriculture. We work with each other on research. We've heard this morning, we're working with each other on food safety. Feeding the world's people, encouraging the use and spread of ag technology. It requires all of us being on the same page. And if you look at a 30-plus year history of the use of the market access and the foreign market development program by a lot of U.S. ag groups, frankly, we are heavily invested as a private sector and a government in modernizing U.S. agriculture. Let's take a step back and look at how we both have a stake in each other's success. Let's frame our dialogue that way, and then let's create some next steps together. That the expectation for that continued partnership is that both of us have an opportunity to gain from that partnership and use this point of leverage to hit the reset button in a little way to say, let's reset the table of who we engage in this dialogue and how we have that discussion.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. And I should have mentioned, because I really liked it in your CV, that you grew up in a family farm in Nebraska?
I did, yes.
So her experience goes back to childhood. I suspect most of you know Gary Martin much better than I do, but let me just say a couple of words. He is President and Chief Executive Officer of the North American Export Grain Association, and he has been in that role since 2000. He got his undergraduate degree at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, a graduate degree at the University of Missouri, and he lives in the Washington area, and he served the administration of George H.W. Bush at the Department of Agriculture as Deputy Administrator of Commodity Operations. So let me ask you, from the industry point of view, where are we?
Thanks, Dennis. And, you know, maybe we ought to start with who is we?
Okay.
I come from a North American association. I work with U.S. groups. Bill and I co-chair the U.S. Food and Agriculture Dialogue for Trade. And I spend half of my time with an international institution based in Geneva, Switzerland. We deal with seeds from plants that move in a bulk form around the world in massive quantities. They're not for propagation. They're for food, feed, or industrial use. They are at the core of global food security. In fact, the balance of global food security in these agribulks, grains, oilseeds, and other agribulks, the critical balance of food security is in that trade, about 600 million tons of trade annually. I think that for those of you that haven't seen a 50,000-ton vessel, which is the most common vessel that arrives with soybeans and corn from the U.S. to China, it's big. So we meet that massive category with just one vessel. By the way, Bill, I think that we've already decided what the path forward is from a U.S. grain and oilseed perspective. Grains, oilseeds, and other agribulks get 175 of the 200 billion. You guys at the meat sector get 25 of the 200 billion, and we'll all be happy. So that's our path forward from a U.S. perspective. But I don't bring the U.S. perspective to very many tables. I bring a global perspective that includes Chinese trade associations. Among the 26 trade associations that are involved in the International Grain Trade Coalition, 3 are Chinese and closely tied to the Chinese marketplace and the Chinese government. I think that we have to realize when we're talking about agribulks, this 600 million tons of commodities, China's responsible currently for the import of about 100 of the 600 million tons, and the production, the largest producer in many cases, of about 15 to 20% of the world's overall supply, which is about 7 or 8 times the 600 million tons that moves internationally to serve 10 to 20% of the demand that really serves global food security, serves the balance between those who have and those who do not, with a perishable product that is produced based on the weather each year somewhere in the world. So our interest is one of global sourcing. We to us is global. Our concerns, and I'm going to cue off of your promotion of Georgetown, our concerns are the most Catholic of any concerns in agriculture. Catholic by the dictionary definition, not the religious definition, in that universally, everyone across the world is concerned about the supply of grains, oilseeds, and other agribulks, and China in particular. Countries that have felt the sting of a lack of nutrition and see the opportunity of improving diets through improved proteins are clearly there. So where are we going from a global perspective? Understand China. Just as we need to understand other great populations with expanded needs. And that's really our entire focus. First, understand China and meet China's needs with what is a competitive supply of grain. Global sourcing, competitive is in the best interest of all consumers up and down the food supply. Now, I want to make sure that as we talk about it, Dennis put in his notes to me that we're going to talk about traceability. And I can certainly understand trust and transparency. But here we're dealing with a bulk fungible product, replacement from all over the world. Remember, we have droughts sometimes in parts of the United States. We certainly have one in Argentina. We often have one in another major supply point in Australia. We have droughts that greatly impact the available supply of this critical piece of global food security in these agribulks. So we move product from around the world to meet the needs of others. So China, 100 million of the 600 million metric tons currently in the import picture is perceived by our industry as both an importer and exporter. Trade's a two-way street. And China's influence on practices from a global perspective is extremely strong. China currently leads, for instance, the International Plant Protection Convention. Everything that is involved in bulk grains and oilseed movement, remember, we have a viable seed that we're moving around the world largely, unless it's been processed. We have a viable seed. It's mixed with seeds from multiple geographies to be provided for in an efficient transportation scheme, not necessarily traceable, because it loses traceability between the origin on the farm and through the accumulation from a 20 to 500 ton lot harvested off the farm to a 50,000 ton lot or 80,000 ton lot on a vessel. And certainly when China receives 10 million metric tons of one commodity in 1 month, which happened in the case of, well, from one origin, which has happened in the case of Brazilian soybeans to China in the month of April, that's an enormous amount of volume moving through a system that necessarily can't trace clear back to the farm, but necessarily relies on a food safety deployment that is effective globally. Meeting China's needs with a global supply is where the global grain industry is coming from. I want to point out a couple of things about where we're at now, maybe not so much where we're going. In times of uncertainty and lack of predictability in trading relationships, one of the critical things that impacts the flow of these agribulks that are so critical to global food security and China's global food security and U.S. agriculture's economic well-being is regulatory measures. And regulatory measures get out of sync with fluctuations in market access, not just market access due to tariffs, but also non-tariff trade barriers. So a big part of where we're going is understanding how to meet China's needs from the global supply chain while providing for consistency over time with regulatory measures. And I really enjoyed everyone's discussion this morning about the deployment of electronic management of trade information, because I would say that's one of the great opportunities in improving transparency, not just with the Chinese market, but with the global supply chain. Enough of an introduction.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Lorraine Holley, and she is the Director of International Government Relations for Archer Daniel Midland's company. Her background is deep on government relations. She worked for Chevron Corporation before she came to ADM. She did some time in the Department of State on a Franklin Fellow program. Graduated from the University of Georgia. She chose the wrong master's program, so she went to SAIS. But she also studied at Oxford, which brings her back a little bit, I suppose. And the most interesting thing on her resume is she is the recipient of the University of Georgia's 40 Under 40 Award, an award presented by the university to outstanding young alumni. So please.
Well, thank you. That's a very generous introduction. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. And I'm going to kind of step back and offer some perspectives from ADM's viewpoint as a global agriculture company. We operate in 160 countries around the world, and we've been doing business in China since 1995. Over that time, we have seen opportunities in China continue to grow year on year. And in fact, China is now our single largest export market. So how did this happen? It happened because of a few reasons. One, China has a growing population. We expect that China's population will reach about 1.4 billion people. They also have an increasing demand for protein products. So while the reference to our meat and meat products for our friends here from the North American Meat Institute, that is driving continued growth and demand for animal feed products, which goes back to oil, seeds, and grains, which are one of ADM's largest export product segments. So what we've seen in China is that the trends in the country are really driving the way that they're approaching agriculture trade and their increasing demand. And what that has meant for the overall agriculture sector is that we as a sector have seen that China has increasingly become a more and more important export market. Last year, I think we exported about 16 billion, or rather, that's just soybeans, about $20 billion worth of agriculture exports to China. And that is double that of any other export segment: machinery, telecommunications equipment, transportation equipment. So it's a very significant part of our economy. So agriculture has really emerged as a key economic driver and a mechanism for opportunity across America's agriculture sector, for rural communities, and then for ranchers, farmers, and other segments in ag manufacturing. So where does that kind of bring us today? So we see that agriculture plays such a critical role in the overall trade relationship with China. We see that it can play a very important role as we talk about reducing the deficit, right? With China, if we've got $20 billion worth of trade going to China through agriculture, that's really important. And so we have some observations about the current landscape for trade. And actually, just one important point, too, to make on the export topic is that the ag exports that we send to China are drivers for really important jobs in rural communities. And this is at a time when farm incomes have consistently declined year on year. So those jobs, not only for the deficit and the economic measures, but also for the job creation and job stability that people have, are very important. So then let me go on to where we are now and where we think maybe we could be going. So right now, we're in a place where we're assessing the bilateral relationship. Clearly, the administration has determined that the previous mechanism for engagement were not working. And that, we're assessing some of the key aspects of the relationship that are problematic. Be that IPR infringement, tech transfer, other issues that have created trade imbalances. And, we really support efforts to address those issues. Those have been issues, for the food and agriculture sector, and market access barriers, investment restrictions, all those things have been preventing us from participating as fully as possible in the Chinese economy. So we'd really like to see those addressed, so we support that. I think what we also would like to support is that there's a really strong mechanism for ongoing bilateral cooperation between the two countries, and that mechanism for cooperation include robust interagency engagement, including with USDA, and includes regular input from the U.S. business community. I think those are all the components that we're looking for as we make a recommendation for how to drive things forward. I think it's only going to be with regular dialogue that we are going to see that some of these long-term systemic issues can really be addressed effectively. And having the business component provide some input into that thinking, I think, is critical. We actually think that the agriculture sector in this overall bilateral discussion is really part of the solution. We should be viewed as a cornerstone any efforts to address these issues, like the deficit that I mentioned before. Our export segments could be even more, if we address some of these market barriers that we see in China, or frictions in market opportunities. So we really see that there is an opportunity for ag to play a very constructive role in the efforts that are being put forward to rebalance the relationship. And I'll just close with the fact that at the end of the day, the U.S. needs to have a positive, stable economic relationship with China. China needs the U.S. for that same reason. And the world and our global partners need the U.S. and China to have a stable economic relationship and a predictable relationship. And it's a very important global factor as well. So I will leave it there, and thank you.
Great. In a few minutes, we'll take questions from the audience, but I thought I would ask a few questions before we do that. So I want to start with Ambassador Vetter. You rightly talked about we want to compete with China. We want to have a healthy competition in all areas of economics. But one of the things people say is, but China isn't an open economy. China is somewhere between a market economy and a command economy these days. So you've done a lot of negotiating. How do you negotiate with a partner who actually does not have the same economic model that we have? And do you think the administration's approach makes some sense in that case?
I think that you are correct that we don't have the same economic model. We don't have the same, obvious, governmental model. And so the steps that each of us have to take with stakeholders, with our Congress, is not the same from the other side in terms of being able to put forward a strategy for negotiating. And you certainly have to take that into account. But I do think we have a number of interests that are very much the same, and achieving those interests will take some common endeavors. And so figuring out within our different models who needs to be at the table and which levers we pull to address those common interests, not in the short term in a purely singular transactional sort of way, but in a longer term relationship way, is I think something that the United States has struggled with, in part because all the partners on the other side have sort of different goals that they're trying to achieve, and they don't always come together in the same room with that same focus. But if you listen to what China has been saying about the significant problems of environmental degradation and the need for them to change their agricultural model to deal with that more effectively. If you think about the challenges they have faced with urbanization and then the need to have more income in rural areas so they don't drive that trend further. How are they going to achieve that? And where are all the places the United States is already helping them do that? And I think, for the purposes of this conversation, we've often pulled trade out of that conversation and stuck it over here, where we've said, and China, by the way, you also need to follow these rules, rather than saying, if your system of how you traded with us worked more transparently and predictably, we could help you achieve these goals. You could get feed grains more reliably so that you could improve your livestock production and create jobs in smaller cities and rural areas in the production of that. You could allow for better joint investment that would provide you access to technologies that would improve your food safety regime. But your underlying trade rules have a bearing on all of those things. But we typically don't engage China in that way. We talk to them about cooperatively the things that we can do, and then we have sort of a USTR trade conversation over here, where we also don't mention in the trade conversation, by the way, we hear your regional officials, we hear your businesses asking for the things that we would like to provide you if we had more certainty and transparency and predictability. So I think getting the right people to the table is critical. And to Lorraine's point, the private sector are those people. One of the things that's frustrating as a federal government official trying to work with China is that I have access only to my federal counterparts, but so much decision making about modernizing and operating China's agricultural sector is really at the provincial level or even at the local level where investments are being made and where they're being asked to implement these policies, often without good tools. So then they're implemented in a more protectionist way than they would have to be, because just saying no is easier than having to do all of the assessment or have people on hand to do enforcement or having labs and methodologies available to do that testing. There are capacity issues here too, but it's hard to discuss them all just in Beijing. And so I think we should give some thought in that way to China's structure and how we engage them at the point of their decision making within that structure. But I don't think the fact that we have two different economic models when we're both trying to achieve the same things for our ag sector should be an obstacle that we can't overcome.
Let me dig just a little further on this, because as you were speaking, I was remembering all the models I've been involved in. So we had the Hank Paulson to Wang Jishan model in the Bush administration. Then we had the strategic and economic dialogue led by Secretary Clinton, Secretary Geithner, Treasury State trying to do this. Then we had the comprehensive economic dialogue that came and went like a shooting star. So clearly we haven't gotten this right yet, or have we? Is there a model that we've used that you think could work, maybe in another part of the world? I don't know.
I think you're right that we haven't gotten that right yet, and the role of agriculture in those particular fora has not been a central one. So I think the way we've treated agriculture in those, and I can speak to the JCCT and the SNED, which are both I've participated in on numerous occasions, is sort of this flurry of activity to set the agenda. So of all the issues that you have and you want to work out, which one will rise to the occasion to get some attention when all of those senior level officials are in town? And then what can you achieve based on that? And I think often what we've done is try to bring big issues to the table, and then we solve a symptom instead of the underlying problem, because that's what you can achieve at that meeting. And then there's a pledge to work on the process. But the pledge about the process is kind of, if you track the statements out of the JCCT, it's kind of the same statement with a little bit of extra detail meeting after meeting. So, a key area that we tried to sort of broaden the conversation and work on would be biotechnology and acceptance of biotech products. And there's sort of, we'll approve a couple of products and we'll work on the process. And then maybe we'll approve a couple of more at the next meeting and we'll work on the process. We still have a lot of concerns about the process. And we still don't have systems that work to not build up another list of products that are, again, not approved and then start to cause trade tension. So we deal with symptoms pretty well, or we deal with discrete issues. We can bring attention to them. We don't sort of set the stage for reform. And again, I don't think agriculture is necessarily alone there, but I think the attention on agriculture has been even smaller because ministers of agriculture do not co-chair any of those fora. And we don't have something similarly high level and continuous in the agriculture space. But I'm not actually arguing to take agriculture out of those conversations, either to elevate it or have a companion, because I do think it is important, and I think Lorraine made this point beautifully, that our agricultural relationship is not some separate thing from the overall economic relationship. It is part and parcel to it, and the concerns that we have about approval of agriculture biotechnology are concerns we have overall about acceptance of technology and technology policy and protection of IP in all other sectors of the economy. And if we can focus then the right minds on that problem, we might get at some of the underlying issues that are not specific to agriculture. So I think cross-fertilization of those issues is important, but I think the sort of flurry of activity around a few issues and then not a lot of follow-up, we haven't linked it with more technical progress in between, and we haven't found a way to link that work in between in a way that has all the agencies at the table focused on a problem and not just that the ag officials go off and do their thing and the Treasury folks do their thing without a holistic view of it.
Can I ask Gary and Lorraine, the ambassador raised this point about perhaps the U.S. government not consulting enough with industry or not bringing industry into these processes. Do you have a view on that? Whether, how much of a role, what kind of role you think the industry should have when these negotiations are going on?
Thanks,
You mentioned
Gary.
it, so.
Well, I think that, there are mechanisms for the private sector to engage. We have our industry trade advisory councils, there's the Agriculture Policy Advisory Council, and other types of mechanisms where the private sector does really have a way to meaningfully contribute to the discussion, and those are very important. I think what we have seen in previous, bilateral dialogues like the JCCT or the SNDD to a certain point is that there are opportunities when the private sector are invited in to consult ahead of those discussions, and that is very helpful on achieving meaningful outcomes. Following up a little bit on Darcy's point, and the fact that we don't have USDA actually in these bilateral negotiations or discussions, and that has not been the historic model. I think that that is something that could be tweaked moving forward, to include the USDA in a more formalized mechanism, because it is such a set of important issues that feed into the trade and other economic discussions.
Gary?
I think the opportunity to have input is considerable. We have an open environment. We have input up and down the public sector, from local governments through state governments all the way to the federal government. But when it comes to delivering, the question is accountability. And I'm being quite frank here, there are no accountability requirements placed on results in the absence of an expectation for where and when we're going to achieve those results. So I think that, in particular in this environment that we're in today, that begs to move away from process and move more to a reactionary and mode of let's see what happens next. I think it's particularly important for goals to be set, not just with agriculture trade, but with any perspective, then measure progress against the goals and hold public sector officials as accountable for the results. I think it needs to be, rather than a focus on what process works, what model works, it's what sort of engagement with individuals will be directed from the executive. I think that was said in one of the earlier discussions today how important individuals are to progress and to success. And it's clear to me that clear direction accompanied with accountability is the only way to make progress, particularly with respect to China.
But can you have that if you don't designate an individual to be in charge of this process?
Overall?
Yeah.
Well, I think you can distribute responsibility. I think that's a role of delegation is a role of any executive. Should be supported by any advisory group. I'm a pretty strong believer in leadership, and I think leadership includes delegation and segmentation. So sure, I think we'd all love to see a spokesperson. I don't know that that's all that practical. I think it's more about what goals need to be achieved, when they need to be achieved, and then measuring against those. Failure is not a problem. Acknowledgement of failure, or the lack of acknowledgement of failure, is a problem. I've learned more from my mistakes than I have from any education, probably the least educated person in the room. But I know this, that until we accept responsibility, measure accomplishment against responsibilities with some leadership to direct that, and then be willing to say, well, this isn't working, let's start over again, we're not going to achieve much. So I'm not sure that I would accept that we have to have a spokesperson. I think we can have leadership and delegation. And in the case of agriculture and in the case of trade negotiations, I think that's very, very important. I think that provides the private sector with some degree of predictability and certainty because they know what to measure against. So those investment flows, as well as the trade flows that we've been focused on recently, have some security in that this is where we're headed. So signals from both governments now about where we're headed is really something that is lacking and can be delegated and diversified from a responsibility and a accountability standpoint.
I
Sure.
want to go back a little bit to this question about input from the private sector and your last question about differences in models and structures. I think one of the things we tried to focus on when we brought together different officials for the JCCT and the SNED was to create these opportunities. This strategic and ag innovation dialogue we brought together with the Agri-Food Partnership was to really spend some time together delving into some of these broader issues with the private sector and government officials in the room. And that was not easy because culturally for the United States, we do that all the time. And we're used to, there are a lot of people in this room who have felt very free to pick up the phone and call and say, I think you should do something different, or I have an idea, or I have a problem, help me fix it. And that's where we are culturally. We would propose this idea to our Chinese counterparts who don't have a system that's open in that way, that their private sector can just set a meeting and go in and talk to their officials. It's not quite as free. And they would come back and say, well, let's have the governments talk to each other in the morning. We could have a private sector speaker at lunch, and then we could go back into a closed government session at the end of the day. And it took a lot of negotiation to say, actually, let's hear from the private sector and hear from governments. They can kick it off and talk about where they're going. Private sector can talk about challenges they have. Let's have a lunch speaker, do it in the afternoon, and then at the very end, governments can get together. And I think the best part about that day was hearing our Chinese counterparts say, well, that was fascinating. I didn't realize that our private sector was doing this, or we should do that again. But it hasn't happened again, in part because structuring their time that way can actually be hard for officials to be approved to come and talk to the private sector. They're supposed to be doing, government business. And so the way that we approach our jobs even, I think, presents sometimes some cultural challenges in how we directly engage then the private sector. And we take that sort of getting results of or making sure we have the priorities of our stakeholders on our agenda. That's sort of part and parcel of the way we're taught to do business. It's different culturally, I think, in China, where how the results fit in with sort of the governmental goals that they've laid out are sort of the way that their progress or that their performance is evaluated.
Let me just make one comment. Sure. And you're right, Darcy. And I think the one element that maybe we've all missed, at least on this panel, I think it was referred to earlier, is sort of that consumer side of things. I note in the last 3 or 4 press releases I've seen from the Chinese government, particularly starting with the withdrawal of the sorghum investigation. Have quite a bit of tunnel vision here on what I look at to try to learn from China. I noticed that the consumer interest in China was referred to publicly. It was referred to publicly in a couple of responses earlier this year as well.
I think even in the joint statement, the Chinese insisted on that language.
Yeah, right? So I think that's a bit of a sea change from a few years ago. And the interest of the private sector came out, the private sector industry in providing for food came out as well in some of those press releases. So I see that as a real opportunity. and listen very closely when people talk about that consumer facing, which I'm far from that in providing raw materials for manufacturing and feeding livestock, et cetera, for food, but find it very interesting that there is acknowledgement, not unlike this, what we saw move in the 50s in Japan, where consumer wasn't necessarily considered. Food security was always the concern, but now we've gone full circle with that very large customer for U.S. agricultural products, where the consumer is the first thought. And I think that is a bit of an evolution and an opportunity to, again, understand better where China's at and where China needs to go.
I just want to follow up with one comment on that, and I fully agree that the Chinese consumers are becoming much more of a focus now than they have been in the past. And you know, ADM is actually co-chair of the U.S.-China Agriculture and Food Partnership, which is the organization that, in part with Walmart, put this together today. And I know you already heard from Jennifer Lee, but who's our secretariat in Beijing. But I wanted to just point out, you know, some of the reasons that we founded the AFP is to create that opportunity for cross-pollination between the private sector and government at a level where there can be dialogue. And that's why it has been so effective. And we've seen a lot of progress in areas where I think we were initially a little bit surprised on the areas, for example, of seed technology or meat and meat products. You know, some of these overarching efforts to really address consumer concerns in China and to make some headway in terms of engagement and you know, really partnership between industry and government has resonated through the AFP. And I think that's a model that has been, it's a track 2 level, I think, effort, but one that is really important in terms of providing that mechanism for dialogue and cooperation.
Well, since I got an upbeat answer, I'm going to stop asking questions now and see what questions we have from the floor. Do we have someone who wants to ask a question? Don't be bashful. If you don't, I'm going to ask more questions. So, okay, I'm going to ask more questions. So, Gary, President Bush used to say to world leaders, what keeps you up at night? So on the food safety side and security side, what keeps you up at night? What is the greatest danger going forward?
I think it's a fair question. Nothing keeps me up at night. I sleep well. But the question that I often try to think about and answer, again, I take on a global perspective in response is what really happens to the ability to provide for nutrition and respond to consumer needs when we have significant market efficiencies built in by policy decisions, inefficiencies built in by policy decisions.
Okay.
So I think a lot in numbers, avoid pricing and all those sorts of things that are antitrust concerns here in the United States, but I think about whether it's U.S. agriculture policy or import policies, what really impedes the ability to take scarce resources, and with China, the scarcest of resources is water.
Right.
And to some degree, land, or land that's fit for production, tend to have enough sunlight, produce the plants that are the foundation of food anywhere in the world. And what really restricts that and distorts the ability to most efficiently, I'm not going to use the word sustainably, but I'm going to use the word efficiently, use and deploy resources in this annually or periodically renewable need that supply that comes from agriculture. So I get very frustrated when we have a circumstance that, to the companies I represent, perhaps their financial benefit, we have a circumstance that reroutes soybeans from the United States to Argentina to be processed into meal and oil so they can re-export to China. That costs $27 a ton minimum probably closer to 50, that shouldn't be a burden on this system that's trying to provide for global food security. It should be as efficient as possible. The market should be able to make those decisions and be facilitated by the policy rather than distorted by policy. So I could go on with a long list of policy distortions that occur in the ability for the world and the globe to feed itself. But at the end of the day, that's the most concerning, that we don't necessarily look at the big picture. We all have our parochial interest. We don't have enough of our Catholic interest, again, with the broad definition. And Jesuits would, I think, understand that better than anyone. So,
Darcy, what keeps you up?
Gosh, well, a lot of things, including small children. But I think that one of the things I've been thinking about a lot as we focus on these bilateral trade relationships is the neglect of the overall system and the leadership role that we could be recruiting our NAFTA partners to help play, to again ask for a larger reform in China, where we might have common interests with China, to be bolstering that system, and sort of the loss of viability of the WTO, of Codex, IPPC, these standard-setting bodies where we need people to put investment into them, to have standards come out of them that the rest of us can have faith in. And the casualties of that system is not the United States. We'll do our own food safety assessments in our labs, and we'll make sure that our food supply is safe. Now, it might be more expensive, and our exports might not get where they want to go as efficiently, and we might not have a dispute settlement system that people obey and put resources into, but we'll probably be okay. It's a lot of our developing country partners who face many more acute problems in providing safe food, who are more import dependent, certainly, than we are on providing for their populations, who can't do all those things themselves, and then won't have a mechanism out there to provide assurances through these international bodies like the WTO to help enforce their own trade rights, or to have confidence at least how other countries are going to treat them and follow the rules, or when it comes to these international standard-setting bodies, to be able to say, I can confidently tell my people that this food is okay to eat, that I have protected my farmers from disease or pests, because countries have willingly all kind of banded together to create these standards that work well. And I think the more we focus on bilateral approaches and bilateral tensions, and the less energy we put into creating regional, multilateral, systemic efficiencies and cooperative mechanisms, that starts to show up eventually in a degradation of that system. And none of us can afford that.
Lorraine.
Well, we have 2 teenage boys, so I could probably just stop there and answer the question. I'm just kidding. No, I think, Gary and Darcy both mentioned the issue of food security, and I think that's something that we've talked a lot about in the past, and I think has lost some of the focus in recent months, but it is a really key issue. And when you look at China, China has about 20% of the world's population and about 10% of its arable land. And so food security is a really significant priority. Not only is it significant for China, but it's a significant global issue. And what we observe is that the US and China together, as 2 of the world's largest economies, can help to play a really critical role in addressing food security issues overall. And of course, there's a lot we can do through economic and international cooperation, looking at things like post-harvest loss and mechanisms to address those issues, other types of efforts to help overcome food security concerns. But I think that together, another reason why we really need to partner on food and agriculture trade is because the US and China together can play such an important global role.
Terrific. Anybody thought of a question? If not, I'd like to thank Darcy, Gary, and Lorraine
Thank you,
for a very, very interesting discussion.
Dennis.
Thanks a lot. Please join me.